In this tutorial, you will learn the basics of front-end web development. It is aimed at people with little or no experience with front-end coding languages such as HTML, CSS and JavaScript. By the end of this tutorial, no matter what your experience is, you should be able to build a fully functional website which features 3 languages that I've mentioned previously. Please feel free at any point in this tutorial to pause it to write some code or go back over anything that may not have seemed clear the first time round. Okay, now let's get started. Firstly, you'll need to download a text editor. The majority of text editors available function exactly the same way, but for the purpose of this tutorial, we'll use Sublime Text 2 as a text editor. It is open source and easy to format the code as well. As the 3 languages featured in this tutorial are all front-end languages, there is no need for the website to be connected to a server. For example, the site can be run locally, so all that you need is a web browser so you can view the website. In this instance, we're going to use Google Chrome. Okay, so now we're going to learn how to use a text editor. Before anything else, you create a folder on your machine and name it in a sort of like a semantic fashion, e.g. my website, with no spaces or anything in the name. This is going to be where you store all the files and the images for your website. So now that we downloaded Sublime Text 2, click File, New File, and once the blank file is opened, save it within the folder that you've previously created with the relevant file extension. And we'll go into that in more detail later on. To maintain a clean file structure, the code we will produce in today's tutorial will be modular, i.e. for each page language there'll be different files inside the folders. This makes it far easier to locate specific parts of the code that needs changing or amending further down the line. Now, as we're using Google Chrome for this, we will look at the Inspect Element tool, or the Development Inspect Element tool that Google Chrome offers. So this is an essential part of web development using the browser's development tools. With each browser it's slightly different, but they essentially do the same thing. In Google Chrome, it's called Inspect Element. So this opens up a new window and allows you to simultaneously see the code you've written and the output of the website in the browser. You can make real-time but temporary changes to see if the output will correctly, and if it does, then you can go back into your text editor and then add the code that you've just tested. If you open up a web page in Google Chrome, right-click anywhere on the page and click Inspect. By default, the tool will appear as part of the window itself, but it's far easier to separate the window out into its own. So to do this, you'd click the 3 dots under the X and then click the left icon named Undock to separate window, and then this will put it into a new window. So there are tabs across the top of the tool, but only the default tab, which is named Elements, is what we need in this tutorial. In this tab, you'll find the HTML down the left-hand side, where each of the HTML element is relevant to the CSS code that you'll see down the right-hand side of the window. As you click through each HTML element, the CSS to go with it will change on the right. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the code. And first, HTML. So this is the introduction. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. So this is what holds the web page together with the images, the videos, and the content. And is arguably known as the skeleton of the website. It's the foundation. Okay, so now we're going to create our very first HTML page. So what you need to do is open up your text editor and create a new file like we did earlier. But before anything else, save this file into the folder you created earlier and name this file index.html. This is essential that your name is exactly like this, because every website must have a HTML file named index, because this is the home page, and it must contain the file extension .html. So next we're moving on to the syntax, or the tags of HTML. So the syntax of HTML is made up of tags, and for every opening tag there must be a closing tag. Well, this is correct for nearly all cases, but that's something we'll go into later on. Whilst the tags in the browser are actually hidden, they determine how the browser formats the code within them. So the opening tag is similar to a greater than sign, and the closing tag is a less than sign. Okay, so this is the first tag you would write in HTML, and this is as follows. And then the closing tag for this would be like this. So these tags wrap everything on every element on the page, even the CSS and JavaScript files. In every other case, the opening tag and closing tag will be identical, where the only difference is that the closing tag will have a backslash in front of it, like you can see here. Okay, so next are the head tags. These tags are placed directly after the opening doc-type HTML tag, and anything within these tags won't appear on the front end, i.e. in the browser. So within these head tags you'll find things like the title, scripts, just like JavaScript scripts, links to external files, even links to internal files like CSS files, JavaScript files, meta information, which is for SEO purposes, which is search engine optimization, something we'll come on to later. And some of the examples of tags that appear here are the title tag. So this element is required in HTML. It appears in the tab of the browser, so it's almost like the name of your site. Style tags. So although CSS code is normally written in a separate document, you can write CSS in the head if you wrap it in style tags, if you only want it to be applied to that page in particular. Link tags. So this tag has no closing element, as you can see. This happens in a few instances, which we'll cover later on in this tutorial. So link tags are there to link the HTML file to the CSS file. So as we talked about earlier, it maintains more modular code format. Another tag that's placed in the head is meta tags. So this contains things like meta description, meta name, and as we mentioned, they're all for SEO purposes. So basically the website can be found on Google. It helps maintain good Google rankings. And finally the script, which is like link tags. So this is usually a link to the HTML page or either internal or external JavaScript files. External fonts, like Google fonts or something like that. So now we're going to talk about the body tag. The opening body tag is placed directly after the closing head tag, and the closing body tag is placed directly before the closing HTML tag. So any element that is intended to be rendered on the web page should be placed within these tags. Here are a couple of examples. So the header tag. This is the first element after the body tag. It's at the very top of the page when displayed in the browser and in the HTML file. This code contains elements like the logo, the title of the web page, important information like phone numbers, emails, and links to other pages. And it also contains the navigation bar. This should be consistent on each page. It might be slightly different on the home page, but it will still keep it within the theme of the website. So the footer is another tag. This is placed just before the closing body tag. It's the last thing that appears in the browser and in the HTML code as well. Elements in between these tags contain things like social media links, sort of terms and conditions pages, policies. So it's similar to the header tag, which is so it's identical on every page, and it can be slightly different, but it tends to be exactly the same. Okay, so that was just a few examples of some header tags. Now we're going to move on to the content tags, which are all the tags that are in between the body tags on the page. So anything that can be rendered in the front end. Okay, so here are some examples of content tags that perform their own purpose. They ought to be placed within the body tags, and they should always be in lowercase, like with any tag. Okay, the first one is a div. This is a container element. It groups different HTML elements together so that they can be collectively positioned on the page. The P tag. This is the paragraph tag for your text. H1 tag, i.e. the title for the page. H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, these are all predefined header tags, and there is only 6 of them. They're all different sizes. These are good to use these, and not just a paragraph tag for SEO purposes. This is the A tag. This is for your links, so it could be external, internal to another website, or internal to another page on the website. So strong tags. This could wrap around a P tag or an A tag or anything that's relevant, and this makes the font bold. UL tags. So this is an unordered list, like bullet points, and an OL tag is an ordered list, so that like numbers 1, 2, 3. And within both of these lists, you would have an LI tag, which is a list element, and this is wrapped either inside the UL or the OL. Okay, the next one is an image file. So it would be image space source, and then you'd insert the source to the path wherever it may be. It could be externally sourced, or it could be within your file structure. This tag does not require a closing tag, simply a slash followed by the closing bracket. Next is a video tag. This is simply to add a video to your website. It could be in the following formats of MP4, .mov, but we'll come to that later. An iframe. This is something like a Google Maps API. Normally you wouldn't have to remember the code for this. You'd get a snippet of the code from Google if it's a Google Maps API or wherever it's relevant. A BR tag. So there's no closing tag on this as well. And this forces a line break. So for things like elements that aren't block level elements, inline elements, this forces a line break, or if you want to break the line in your text, this will do this. HR, this is a horizontal line. Again, there's no closing tag needed. That just simply puts a full width horizontal line across your page if you want to break up some text or for any purpose that you'd like. Okay, so now we move on to structure and nesting of your HTML tags. So nesting is very important as it can dramatically affect the output and break your code. This would impact what the user sees in the browser. So if the elements are not nested correctly, i.e. if the closing tags are not in the correct place. Structure is still important, but only important for the developer. A new block style element should be displayed on a new line and then indented within its wrapper or sort of parent elements. For example, a div element should be placed on a new line, but a link tag, should not. So take a look at these examples of the wrong and the right way to do it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to attributes. So all HTML elements can have attributes. So attributes provide additional information about an element. Attributes are always specified in the start tag, not the closing tag. And attributes usually come in a name value pairs, like name equals, in quotes, value. Okay, so the first attribute example we're going to talk about is HREF. Example of this HREF attribute is on an A or link tag. The reason we add this attribute is so we can specify where the link should take the user to, whether it is between pages on a website, i.e. an internal link, or whether it's on another website, i.e. an external link. An absolute URL is when the full URL is included, i.e. the domain name like https://www.mywebsite.com. But if you're navigating between pages, you do not have to include the domain, just the subfolders and the file name. You only include the full URL if you are navigating to an external link. Okay, so take a look at these examples here to see. So the first one is a link to Google, which is an external link. So you use the full URL, the absolute URL. The next is an internal link where we still use the full URL with a slash and the page name. And the final is an internal link without the absolute URL. We do not need to include the domain name because this maintains good, clean code. Okay, so the next attributes we're going to talk about are source, alt, width, and height. These attributes are applied to the image tag. They're used to set the path of the file image so that it can be displayed, and the width and the height of the image. And finally, the alt tag is the fallback if the image does not display for the user. So therefore, this is a description of the image. You can use external or internal images here, but remember it is good practice not to use the absolute URLs for images that are internal, i.e. the images that you are hosting. Here is an example. As you can see, we've specified the source, the width, the height, and the alt, all in the syntax previously mentioned, name equals, and between the speech marks, between the brackets, it is value. The final attribute we're going to talk about is the style attribute. So this attribute can be applied to almost any HTML element that is rendered on the front end. In this tag, you would insert CSS code that will be directly applied to that HTML element and only that HTML element, i.e. the CSS code is the value. Another name for this method is inline styles, but it should only be used where absolutely necessary. Better practice would be to use an external style sheet. Please see this example below of this in action. Okay, so next we move on to formatting, more specifically text formatting. You can format text with nested HTML tags. This includes bold, italic, superscript, subscript, etc. HTML also defines special elements for defining text with a special meaning. So in HTML, you can use elements like B, like a B tag, an I tag, formatting the output, like bold or italic. Formatting elements were designed to display special types of text. So see some examples here. So B is bold text, strong is important text, I, italic text, EM, emphasized text, mark, marked text, small, small text, del, deleted text, ins, inserted text, sub, subscript text, and sup, subscript text. So take a look at these examples below of these in action. Okay, so comments. Comments in HTML are very important. So you can add your comments to your HTML source code by using the following syntax. Open angle bracket, exclamation mark, and 2 hyphens. This is the opening comment tag. To close it, you insert 2 hyphens followed by a closing angle bracket, like so. Okay, so now move on to colours. HTML colours are specified using predefined colour names, or they can be used with hex, RGB, or RGBA values. You can specify a colour by predefined colour names. In fact, there are 140 that are supported. So some examples of this would be red, green, aqua, blue, black, white, etc. You can assign these via CSS, where the most common forms are colour, border colour, background colour. Here is an example. Whilst you can use predefined colours, it is more often than not that you would use specific colours in the form of hex codes and RGBA/RGBA values. Hex values are made up of 6 numbers and letters, and it could be a mix. It could be all numbers, or it could be all letters, or a mix of both. RGB is made up of 3 numbers, from 0 to 225, separated by a comma. The first value is the red value, the second is the green, and the third is the blue. The A in RGBA is alpha. That sets the opacity, so you can set this number between 0 to 1 decimal place, e.g. 0.7. So the RGBA would be 0 to 255 for the first 3 items, and then 0 to 1 for the alpha as the last item. So here is an example of this being used as well. Assigning classes and IDs to HTML elements. So in HTML you can add IDs, but more commonly you would add classes to any element. You can then target these classes and IDs through your CSS code. So the reason you do this is so that you can set specific styles to only the relevant or specific elements. So to add a class to an element, you would write class equals, and then in quotes, class, the class name. This will be written inside the opening body tag, and then between the opening body tag and the closing body tag. Likewise, with an ID, you would write it within the opening body tag, and you would write ID equals, and in bracket, and in quotes, ID name. But you should only use an ID where absolutely necessary if you want to override certain styles, because ID is seen as more important or unique. But it can only be applied to one element, so only one ID can be assigned to one element, unlike classes. But that's something we'll get onto later on. Okay, so to declare a class in your CSS file, you would write a dot followed by your class name, e.g. dot intro, or even the element dot and then the class name. So p dot intro would be an example, if you wanted to apply intro to only a paragraph tag. To declare an ID in CSS, you would do exactly the same way, except instead of a dot, you would use a hashtag. So for example, element, hashtag, and the ID name. If you had some introduction text that is to be featured on every page and needs larger, bolder text to be in capitals and to be a light khaki colour, then you do something like this. And in the CSS file, you would do this. As previously mentioned, you can assign multiple classes to the same element. You can assign any number of classes to an element. You'd simply separate them with a space. Multiple elements can share the same styles, but one sort of element may need a different styling to it or additional styling. So if we look at this example, there are 3 paragraphs with the class story_content, which is one class. The first paragraph has a class of intro as well. So this indicates that this class needs further styles. So it indicates that this class would need the story_content styles as well as the intro styles. In your CSS, make sure you write the styles for the paragraph element with the class intro after story content. CSS sees elements further down the file as more important and it overrides them, i.e. styles at the end of the page override styles further up the page. But don't worry, we'll go into CSS in more detail later on in the tutorial. But the reason why we use multiple classes is so that the styles from certain classes can be shared between all elements that are necessary. It's just so that the CSS file is shorter and it will result in a faster loading website, more efficient. Okay, so here are 2 examples. The first uses only one different class for each element, so the styles get repeated and overlapped. But the second uses 2 classes, so the first paragraph element, so that the styles aren't repeated and the code is actually shorter. So you can actually use the same classes on different elements and have different stylings applied to them. So it is good practice to write semantic classes in HTML and CSS. It makes the code more readable and easier to understand for when the class needs to be amended, or if the code is passed on to another developer. Sometimes it seems best fit to apply the same class to 2 different elements, but these elements may need different styles applied to them. So take this example here. Both the name and the position of the staff member have the same class applied, but they need different styles. But to do this, you would target the classes in the same way in CSS, dot, and then class name, with the difference being that you would prefix the element tag, e.g. like this, so h2 dot staff underscore member and p dot staff underscore number. Okay, so now we're going to move on to lists in HTML. So lists can be in 2 forms, as we mentioned previously. So the unordered lists and ordered lists, which are then UL and OL tags, respectively. With both these types of lists, there is a list item tag, which is written as LI. The more commonly used type of list is an unordered list, which is UL, as it means the list items output and bullet points by default, and ordered lists are numbers. So take a look at these examples, and try them out for yourself and view them in your browser. So now we're going to move on to navigation, where we use unordered lists here to create a navigation bar. So to create a navigation bar, i.e. a list of links to other pages on the websites, you'd use an unordered list containing list elements and A tags, which are links. And you surround all of this in nav tags, which is just good for SEO purposes and good for the structure of the page for when another developer might view it. So to style the list so the bullet points don't appear, and usually position the elements side by side, but it depends on how you want the list. So if you had the list in the top navigation bar where the header is, you would have them side by side, but if you had it in the sidebar, you'd want them to stack. So take a look at this example here. Okay, so now let's look at what block level elements are in HTML. So block level elements always start on a new line, and they take up the full width available, so they stretch out from as far as they can left to right, unless there's specific styles been applied to them. So some examples of these block level elements are address, article, aside, block quote, canvas, DD, div, DL, DT, field set, fig caption, figure, footer, form, header, HR, LI, main, nav, no script, OL, output, P, pre, section, table, tfoot, UL, and video. So we're going to look further into probably the most commonly used block level element, which is the div. So the div element is often used as a container for other HTML elements. It has no required attributes, but both style and class are common. More commonly, class. We try to avoid style when necessary. When used together with CSS, the div element can be used to style blocks of content. Take a look at this, for example. Now, alternatively to block level elements, we have inline elements. So an inline element does not start in a new line, it only takes up as much width as necessary, unless, as before, unless it's specified otherwise, unless it's set to have a width of 100% or etc. So some examples of inline elements include A, abbrev, acronym, B, BDO, big, BR, button, site, code, DFN, EM, I, image, input, KBD, label, map, object, Q, samp, script, select, small, span, strong, sub, sup, which is subscript and superscript, text area, time, TT, and var. Like with before, we're going to look closer into one of the inline elements, in particular span, as it is probably the most commonly used inline element other than the A tag. Okay, so the span element is often used as a container for some text. It has no required attributes, but again, the style and class is common. So similarly to div elements, when used with CSS, the span element can be used to style parts of the text. So like a little small section of it, and the text will still be in line as you'd expect. So look at this example here of this being used. So now we're going to look at layouts. So layouts in HTML are important. It maintains a consistent website with easy to read code. So in theory, you don't have to use layout tags in HTML, but it's wise to use them for search engine optimization, SEO purposes, which is essentially your rankings on Google. So the better your SEO, the more chance you have of clients, users finding your website through a Google search. So here are some examples of layout tags. The most commonly arguably essential are header, nav, and footer. So the header, this defines a header for the document of a section. Nav defines a container for navigation links. Section defines a section in the document. Article defines an independent self-contained article. Aside defines content aside from the main content, so it acts as like a sidebar. And the footer defines the footer of the document. Okay, so here is an example of this in action. So as you can see, the header is at the top, and that's in red, and that's full width. Then followed by the nav bar, which is also full width. Then you see from the section, the article, they're both in a div that is floated to the left and it has a 50% width. And each of those elements has a height of 400 pixels. So they sit on top of each other. And then also with the aside element, that is also 50% width, and that has a height of 800 pixels, which is the height of the full container. And as you see at the bottom, we have the footer, which is 100% width and a background of red. So this has essentially the same styles as the header. So now we're going to move on to responsive web pages. So responsive web design makes your web page look good on all devices, whether it be desktops, tablets, phones, etc. This makes the elements on your page resize, shrink, hide, etc. in relation to the width and or height of the browser window or the device. Essentially, it's the same code as used for all devices, just the CSS for that code changes depending on the height, the width, the browser and the device. We'll come on to the CSS chapter, so don't worry about it for too much for now. But the first thing to do would be to add the following meta tag within the head tags of every HTML page in use. So this sets the viewport width, sets the viewport, giving the browser instructions on controlling the dimensions of the elements on the page. Okay, so still with responsive web pages, but we'll move into responsive images. You can of course set the images to be a fixed width in pixels, or you can set them to have responsive widths in percentages. Let's take a look at this example. These are two images side by side. Both are set to 50% width and are floated side by side using the float left CSS element. Again, don't worry about floats. We will talk more about that in the next chapter, in the CSS chapter. Okay, now let's move on to entities. So certain characters in HTML can't be used. For instance, the greater than and less than signs shouldn't be used as they're used for tags. So the web page will get confused because you can't have more than one use for something. So entities are put in place to display these reserved characters. So an entity name or number is displayed with the AND symbol in front of it and a semicolon at the end. Not every browser will support all entity names, but the majority of modern browsers do. So as we're using Google Chrome, that supports it better than any other browser, apart from maybe Firefox. So for example, in HTML you can only add a single space in between elements. If you want to add two or more blocks of white space, you would use the white space entity. And that entity is the AND symbol, followed by NBSP, and then finish off with a colon. Semicolon, apologies. So examples of other HTML entities are the less than, greater than, ampersand, the double quotation mark, single quotation mark, or an apostrophe, cent, pound sign, yen, euro, copyright, and registered trademark. Now let's move on to symbols. There are many mathematical and currency symbols that are not available through the keyboard. Like with the previous chapter, we need to use entities to display these certain symbols, but it's a different means of doing it. So here's a list of the mathematic examples that you could use that aren't available on the keyboard. And then here's a list of some other examples which would be more commonly used that again aren't displayed on the keyboard. Now we go to look at accessibility. You should write HTML with accessibility in mind. Provide the user with a good way to navigate and interact with your site. Make your HTML code as semantic as possible so that the code is easy to understand for visitors and for screen readers as well. Okay, so now we're going to look further into semantic HTML. Semantic HTML means using correct HTML elements for their correct purpose as much as possible. Semantic elements are elements with a meaning. So if you need a button, use the button element and not a div. So here's an example of a semantic way to use a button and a non-semantic way to use a button. Okay, so let's look into semantic headings. So as we already know, there are 6 headings. So headings 1 to 6 in H1, H2, H3, H4, H5 and H6. So the reason heading tags are so important is so that search engines can identify the structure and the context of the web page. For example, there should only be one H1 tag for each page. So this way a search engine can identify the content for this page. E.g., if the H1 tag is about us, and the search engine will display this as an about us page to the user. Okay, so now we're going to move on to alternative text. Alternative text, or alt text, is used to associate text with an image. The text describes what the image is and is put in place for circumstances where the image cannot be displayed to the user. For example, if they're using a screen reader. An example of this would be the next section we're going to talk about is HTML forms. We'd use the form tag to wrap an entire form. This defines the section which is used to collect user input. There must be an opening and closing form tag. Just by having form elements in your HTML, nothing will show up in your browser. You must define the specific elements to go within your form. For example, name, email, message, etc. The first form element we're going to talk about is input. So this is probably the most common element field in a form, is the input tag. This requires no closing tag. To make the input tag more specific, you would have to set the type attribute. So here are some examples. Input type equals text, which is where there's a simple text input. Input type equals radio, so which is radio buttons. So there's multiple choice, but only one option can be chosen here. Input type equals check. This is where there's a checkbox. It's multiple choice, but you can have more than one option here. And then input type equals submit. This is what the input button to submit the form once complete. The text input is used for inputting plain text on a single line. For example, first name and surname. You must define this as name equals, and then in quotation marks the attribute, which makes it unique and easy to read when the form is returned to the owner from the user. The placeholder attribute is the text that is already in the form before the user adds their own input. This is to indicate the type of information that is needed to be added into that specific field or input type. An alternative to the placeholder attribute is to add a label tag just before the input field or after it, depending on how you'd like it to be styled. The label tag requires both an opening and closing tag, unlike the input. Here are some examples here. So using the placeholder attribute, you could put input type equals text, name equals first name, then placeholder equals insert first name here. And then using the label attribute, you would put label, the label tag, insert surname here, and then closing label tag. And on the new line, you would put input type equals text, name equals surname. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the radio button attribute. So the user can select only one option here by adding checked within the first input field. This is what it will default to. So here's an example of this. So input type equals radio, name equals age, and value equals 18 to 30. And then you would, within the opening or within the bracket, the tag, you would put the word checked. And then outside of the bracket, you'd put the value. And then do this for any number of values that you'd like. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the select element in more detail. The select element defines a drop-down list, and then the option element defines an option that can be selected. So by default, the first item in the drop-down list is selected. So see this example here. So we have the select tags, which is select name equals phone. So this is the name of the options, and then you'd wrap that around all of the option values. So it's a similar method to an ordered and ordered lists, where the select would be the UL or the OL tag, and the option would be the LI tags. So in the options, you put option value equals, and then specify that value, and then there'd be a closing option tag as well. And within those two tags, you'd put the value or the name, what you'd like the user to see. Okay, so the next chapter of this tutorial is going to be CSS. So what CSS stands for is Cascading Style Sheets. And as you might guess from the name, CSS determines how the HTML elements will be styled, and essentially it controls the layout of the web page. So these style sheets are usually stored in external files, which are named with the file extension .css. Okay, so 3 ways of adding or inserting the CSS to your web page. The first is an external style sheet. So this is when your style sheet is in a separate file or multiple files, depending on how big your website is, and you know, as we talked about earlier, modular code is good. So the next one is internal style sheet. So this is when you include the style tags within the head of your HTML document, and then in there you'd write your CSS code, like we were doing in the HTML tutorial previously. And the final one is inline styles. So this is when you directly apply CSS to a HTML element inside of the brackets of the opening tag. So you do p style equals, and then within the brackets you'd write the CSS declaration. So the most common and best practice method is to use external style sheets, which is what we will be demonstrating today. So your HTML file reads inline styles first, then internal styles, and followed by external style sheets. This may seem strange, as it seems the external style sheets have the lowest priority, but this is because in some cases inline styles and internal style sheets must be used, though it won't be the case very often with this tutorial. So depending on the size of the website, there is usually more than one CSS file, as it helps maintain modular code. E.g. for when there's a style sheet for desktop, there might be another one for mobile or iPad or other desktop or other tablet devices. Okay, so now you have a better understanding of what CSS actually is. We're going to create an external CSS file. So first, in the website folder that you created earlier, the one I called My Website, create another folder called CSS or Assets, whichever seems most relevant to you. I prefer CSS personally, but it's entirely up to you. So this is going to be the folder where you save your CSS files. So go into Sublime Text 2, click File, New, and create a new file. And before anything else, you must save this file with the file extension .css and name it something semantic like styles.css, and then save this into the folder you just created. Okay, so the next section is how to. So now the next step is to link this CSS file to your HTML code. So if you go back to the index.html file we've been working on earlier and click anywhere within the head tags, and you'll need to add the following link tag, like so. Link rel equals style sheet. The type equals text/CSS, just so the HTML file knows what type of file it's reading. And the href, or the source, is the link to the style sheet. So in this case, it's the folder CSS / and then the file name, which is styles.css. Okay, so let's move on to the syntax. So in CSS, there are two distinct blocks: selectors and declarations. So you start by writing the selector, like so, and then you write the declaration within the curly brackets and format it, like so. A declaration is broken down into two parts: the property and the value of that property. The property and the value are separated by a colon, and each declaration is separated by a semicolon, and then you'd format it like so underneath each other. So within a CSS rule set, there can ultimately be an infinite number of selectors assigned to an infinite number of declarations. So where the selectors are separated with a comma and the declaration separated with a semicolon. The reason why you do this is so that you can have more than one selector if there are multiple different HTML elements that require the exact same styles, or at least share a significant amount. So, but more commonly, there's only one selector to many declarations. Okay, so now we're going to move on to comments. So comments are useful in CSS, just like they are in HTML. So we may need to write commented lines within our CSS file to split up sections and group certain styles together, to locate them easier when making alterations later on. So comments can also be used to comment out certain code that needs to be temporarily not displayed on the website in the browser. So to comment out the code, you would write a / followed by an asterisk, and then you would insert the code, or the commented code rather, in between, and then you'd end the comment with an asterisk followed by a /. You can span these comments over multiple lines. They are not single line comments, as we will do later in the next chapter. So here is an example where the bottom two lines are commented out. The declarations text transform uppercase and text align center are both commented out and will not display in the browser. Styling classes and IDs. This is something we previously mentioned in HTML chapter, but we'll take this bit as just a refresher, and we'll go into more detail about the classes and ID styling. So IDs have a higher level of importance compared with classes, and IDs are unique, so they can only be assigned to one element. So when assigning classes in CSS, you start the selector with a dot, and then with IDs, you start the selector with a hashtag. But you can prefix both the class and the ID with the element, as we previously mentioned in HTML. This just makes the targeting it more specific, and you won't override certain styles later on. So here's how you do this. So the selector, in this case h2, with dot followed by a class name, and that's how you declare a class. It's similar with an ID. You'd write the selector, the hashtag, and then the ID name. And then within the curly brackets, that's where you'd write the declarations for that variable. Okay, so now let's get into the more technical stuff. So let's look at the box model. So this is margins, borders, paddings, etc. So all HTML elements can be considered as boxes. In CSS, the term box model is used when talking about the design and the layout. So the CSS box model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element, and it consists of margins, borders, padding, and then the actual content itself. So from inside to outside, we would go content, followed by padding, then border, and then on top of that, margin. So let's talk about that in more detail. So content. Here's the content of the box. It's where the text, the images, etc. appear. So the padding. So it clears an area around the content. So the padding is transparent but contains the element. E.g., a padding of 15 pixels will make the element 15 pixels bigger in every direction. The border. This is the border that goes around the padding and content. Again, it makes the element bigger. Margin. This clears an area outside the border. So the margin is transparent. It's used to separate different elements clearly. So here's an example of all the box model elements applied to a div. The total width of this element would be width plus border plus padding plus margin, which is 175 pixels plus 4 pixels for the border, 2 pixels each side, plus 50 pixels, 25 pixels each side for the margin, for the padding, and then 0 for the margin, because the margin doesn't actually make the element bigger. So the final answer would be 229 pixels. Okay, so let's talk in more detail about margins. The CSS margin property is used to create space around elements outside of any defined borders. So with CSS, you have full control over the margins. There are properties for setting the margin for each side of the element, which goes top, right, bottom, and left. So as we previously said, the margin has 4 sides, and you'd write this as margin top, margin right, margin bottom, and margin left. And the most common values for these properties are auto, length, which is usually a fixed pixel length, like 40 pixels, percentage, so percentage of the container width, and then inherit, which means that the margin value is the same as the parent value of this element. So here is an example of this applied to a paragraph tag. So margin top is 60 pixels, margin right is auto, margin bottom is 10%, and margin left is inherit. Or we can write this in the shorthand version, which goes from in one declaration. So we would write margin, and the first element would be top, the second would be right, the third would be bottom, and the fourth would be left. So it would be top 60, right auto, bottom 10%, and left inherit. Okay, now let's look into padding in more detail. So the CSS padding property is used to generate space around the element's content inside of the defined borders. Adding padding to an element actually makes it larger. So with CSS you have full control over the padding like with margins, and there are properties for setting the padding for each side of an element, like with margin again, top, right, bottom, left. And you'd write these as padding hyphen top, padding hyphen right, padding hyphen bottom, and padding hyphen left. So here are some examples. They're all identical. You can write the values in the same declaration like with margin. So here we go. Div, There's padding hyphen top of 50 pixels, padding right of 30 pixels, padding bottom of 50 pixels, and padding left of 30 pixels. So you can also write this as padding 50 pixels for the top, 30 right, 50 for the bottom, and 30 for the left. Or there was an even shorter version of this. If the top and the bottom pixels are identical and so are the left and the right, we can write 50, 30 pixels, which is identical to the statements above. Okay, so the final section we're going to talk about in the box model is border. So in CSS, the border property allows you to set the color, the width, and the style of the border on an element. So you can set the border on all sides of the element, or either any number of the sides, top, bottom, left, right, as you can with padding and margin. So border style. So you set the style of the border to be with the property border hyphen style. And the following properties of this are dotted, it defines a dotted line, dashed defines a dashed border, solid, the most common one, so it defines a solid border, double defines a double border, groove, it defines a 3D grooved border, but the effect depends on the border color value. Ridge defines a 3D ridged border, inset defines a 3D inset border, outset defines a 3D outset border, none defines no border at all, and hidden defines a border but it's hidden. So if it was 2 pixels, there'd be a 2 pixel border, but you just would not be able to see it. So here's an example. So as we've got a div here with a class of dashed border. So we wrote div.dashed underscore border, and then within the curly brackets we would write border hyphen style is dashed. Now let's move on to border width. So the width can be set as a specific size, inches, pixels, pt, cm, centimeters, em, etc. But we're using one of the 3 predefined values, thin, medium, or thick. So here's an example of this. Again, we use the same class with the div. So border style is dotted, and border width is 12 pixels. Okay, now let's move on to border color. Like with the other color properties, you can set the color by using the following: hex value, which is a hashtag followed by 6 numbers and or letters. It can be a combination of both, or either just numbers or just letters. So RGB/RGBA values, so 3 numbers from 0 to 25 separated with a comma, and then the 4th value in the RGBA is a value between 0 and 1, and this sets the alpha or the opacity. So name, these are preset colors like we've talked about previously: red, green, blue, etc. And then transparent, which is literally the word transparent in lowercase. Again, this is when we want to set the border around it, but for it not to be visible. This could be useful in a hover state function, something we'll later talk about in this chapter. So seeing as an example here, so div.border color, border underscore color, because this is the class name on the div, and then we'll set border style equals solid, and then the border color, and in this case I've set it as a hex value, so it's hash 879071. Okay, so here's some full examples. So you can set the width, style and color in the same declaration to make the code more efficient and shorter. So the syntax is border with a colon, and then 3 declarations: width, style, color, all separated with a space. So here are some examples of these properties in action. So div.first, if we're applying the styles to a class, so it's to a div with a class of first. So we go border, colon, 3 pixels, solid black. This would mean that there's a solid black border of 3 pixels around the element. And then div.second, if we want to set different colors, so we could set border hyphen top is 4 pixels solid black, border bottom is 4 pixels solid black, The border left is 3 pixels solid 879071, that hex code, and the same with border right. There is no order which these have to appear in. You could have border bottom declared at the top of the statement. The order here does not matter. Now let's move on to position. So the position property specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. So there are 5 different types of position values, where in this case the relative is probably the most common. So we have static, relative, fixed, absolute and sticky. But don't worry what these mean at the moment. We're going to talk about each section next. So the first position we're going to talk about is position static. So HTML elements are positioned static by default. So static position means the elements are not affected by the top, bottom, left and right properties. The element with position static is not positioned in any special way. It is always positioned according to the normal flow of the page. So here's an example. So div.static, this is applying to a div with a class of static. So position static with the border of 3 pixels, a solid followed by a hex value, a height of 50 and a width of 700, both in pixels. So try this out in the browser and see what the result is. So the next position we're going to talk about is position relative. So an element with position relative is positioned relative to its normal position. So setting the top, right, bottom and left properties of a relatively positioned element will cause it to be adjusted away from its normal position. Other content will not be adjusted to fit into any gaps left by the element. So here is an example. So we have a div here with a class of relative. So we set div.relative and then we set a position of relative on that div. Then a margin of 15 pixels, 30 pixels, which would mean the top and the bottom have 15 pixels of margin and the left and the right have 30 pixels. And then followed by a border of 3 pixels solid followed by a hex value. So the next element we're going to talk about is position fixed. So an element with position fixed is position relative to the viewport, which means it always stays in the same place even if the page is scrolled. The top, right, bottom and left properties are used to position the element. So a fixed element does not leave a gap in the page where it would normally have been located, like with the other 2 positions we previously talked about. So here's an example. So we've got a div here with a class of fixed. So we set position fixed on this div, then we set bottom and right both of 0, a width of 300, and then a border of 3 pixels solid followed by a hex value. So if you try this out yourself, you'll notice that the div is fixed to the bottom and the right of the page with a width of 300 pixels. The next position we're going to talk about is position absolute. So an element with position absolute is positioned relative to the nearest positioned ancestor, instead of positioned relative to the viewport like fixed. However, if an absolute positioned element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the document body and moves along with the page scrolling. So a positioned element is one whose position is anything except static. So here is a simple example. So if you create 2 divs, one with a class of relative and one with a class of absolute, and apply the following styles to them, you'll see the difference in the positions. And the final position is sticky. So an element with position sticky is positioned based on the user's scroll position. So a sticky element toggles between relative and fixed, depending on the scroll position. It is positioned relative until a given offset position is met in the viewport. It then sticks in place, like position fixed. So here is an example. So we have a class of sticky applied to a div, and apply the following styles to it, and make sure that the sticky element works in most browsers, but in Safari we need to add a WebKit prefix, and also one for iOS devices. So apply these following styles in your example and you'll see what the outcome is. Okay, so now that we've talked about all the position elements, there's one more element that comes into the category of positioning. which is called z-index. So when elements are positioned, they can actually overlap other elements. But the z-index property specifies the stack of order of an element, which element should be placed in front of, behind of others. So an element can have a position or a negative stack order, but it must include a position when you apply this. Okay, so here's an example. So to an image, we're going to put a position of absolute on. Then we set some styles like left and top, and then the z-index is set to -1. To do this in your browser against other elements, and you'll see what the outcome is. In the next section, we're going to talk about the display property. So the display property specifies if and how an element is displayed. So every HTML element has a default display value depending on what type of element it is. So the default display value for most elements is either block or inline. So examples of block level elements or block displayed elements by default are divs, H1s through to H6s, p tags, form, header, footer, section, etc. And then example of inline elements are span, image, etc. So you can display inline elements as block elements and vice versa. So see these examples. So here is a list element, and we're setting it to display inline, or it could be display inline block. So it's different from block. And then we can just set the A element to be display block, where its default is display inline. So we're going to go further into the display category and talk about display none. So display none is commonly used with JavaScript to hide and show elements without actually deleting them and having to recreate them on the page. So this is quite common with things like navigation bars, or when you go down to mobile, other elements need to hide because it doesn't work with the structure and the flow. But we'll talk about more about this later on. Okay, so the next section is visibility hidden. This also hides an element similarly to display none. However, the element will still take up the same space as before. So the element will be hidden but still affect the layout, where display none will not take up any space at all. So take a look at these two examples of display none and visibility hidden. So as you can see, try those out in your browser, and as you can see, the space it takes up is different on both of them. So the next chapter is going to be backgrounds, more specifically imagery and colour. So there are many different properties you can apply to backgrounds. Some of those popular ones are background colour, background image, background repeat, background attachment, and background position. But do not worry, we'll go through exactly what they do now. So background colour. The background colour property specifies the background colour of an element. So the background colour of a div is set like this. Please note you can use hex values and RGB values, but we'll just use predefined values just for the purpose of this exercise. So this example, there's a div with a class of orange, and we'll set the background colour to be orange. So do this for yourself and take a look at the effect in the browser. You can set some other properties like height, width, etc. to see what it will actually look like. Okay, so now we're going to talk about background image. The background image property specifies an image to use as the background of an element. By default, the image is repeated so it covers the entire element. There are many different properties you can add to a background image. Some examples are background repeat, background size, and background position. So the background image for a div can be set like this. Please take a look at this example. So we can set the background image. So we set the background image property with a colon, and then we set the value. So it's URL, and then in parentheses, and then in quotes, we put the path to the image. And then we can set other properties within this. So we've set a width of 100%, a relative position, a height of 500 pixels. The background repeat, we've set that no repeat, and background size cover. So this makes sure that the element covers the entire 100% width and 500 pixels that we've set. But please bear in mind that sometimes the image may be covered or hidden, just parts of the edge, just so it fits the specifications. Then we've set the background position to be center. This means that it's vertically and horizontally aligned in the center, based on the center of the image. Okay, so now let's move on to fonts. So the CSS font property defines weight, style, size, and the family of the font. So there are three main types of font that you can use. These are sans serif, serif, and then monospace. So monospace is a style of font that you'd see in your code. If the name of a font family is more than one word, it must be in quotation marks. For example, Times New Roman or Courier New. So here are some examples of these. So a serif font, we have a font family of Times New Roman, and then we put a comma, serif in the value because it's a serif font. This is a fallback. And then the next one example we have sans serif. So the font family is Verdana, and this is sans serif as we mentioned. But as this is only one word, quotation marks are not needed. And finally, we have a monospace font family, which is Courier New. And again, it's ended, the value is ended with a comma and then monospace as a fallback. Try these out for yourself. Now let's look further into fonts, more specifically font style. So there are normally three sort of main font styles or default font styles you can use. These are normal, this is the normal font style, italic, so you can put the text in italics, and then oblique. So this is similar to italics, but the text is leaning, although this is less supported in browsers. So here are some examples. We've got three H2s here, all with different classes, normal, italic, and oblique. And we've set the font styles on each of these to be the name of the class. So take a look at this, do this in your browser, and take a look at the results. So now let's move on to font size. There are many different values you can apply to font size. These are pixels. So pixels is a set size. It does not take into account other font sizes or screen device widths. EM. So this is relative font or dynamic font. So 1 EM is equal to 16 pixels, which is the default size in browsers. So the formula for this is pixels divided by 16 equals EM. Inherit This inherits the size of the parent font, wherever that may be. If one isn't set, then it defaults it to 1 EM, i.e. 16 pixels. VW, so this stands for viewport width. So 100 viewport width is the full width of the device, no matter what elements are on the page. So this is a responsive font, so it would scale down or up as the device or browser gets smaller and larger. So percentage, this is usually used in conjunction with other fonts. So usually if you set the body element to have a font size of 90%, then 1 EM on the other elements would equal to 90% of 60 pixels, i.e. 14.4 pixels. So here are some examples of all of these font sizes, or font style font sizes, in action. And lastly, we're going to talk about font weight. So there are two pre-built font weights in CSS. These are normal and bold. So depending on your font family, you may be able to specify your font weight further. So font weights can start from 100 to 900. So 100 being the thinnest, 200 being a thin font, 300 is the default light font, 400 is normal, that's default, 500 semi-bold, 600 is semi-bold / bold, depending on your font family. Bold is 700, 800 is bold or very bold, again depending on your font family, and then very bold is 900. So here are some examples of these in action. Please take a look and try them out on your browser and see for yourself. Okay, so now we're going to look at text in CSS. There are many properties that can be applied to text, and these include text align. This sets the horizontal alignment to either be left, center, or right, or justified. Text transform. So you can transform your text or force your text to be either capitalized, uppercase, or lowercase, depending on the input. So text decoration. So this removes decoration from the A tags if you set it to text decoration none, or to other text you can add things like text decoration underline, and that will put an underline on your text. Letter spacing. The letter spacing in between each character, where the default is actually 0, but in some cases you might want to increase this just for styling purposes. Word spacing. This is the spacing between each of the words. Text indent. So this indents the first line of text in a paragraph. Text direction. Although it is uncommonly used, it changes the direction of the text. E.g., RTL is right to left. Line height. So this is the height between the lines in the paragraphs. Again, the default is 1 EM, which is the equivalent of 16 pixels. Text shadow. So this adds a shadow on the text with a specified shadow size, blur, radius, and color. So here are some examples of all of these in action. Please take a look at them yourself, try them in your browser, play around, change them, and see what you can do. So the next thing we're going to talk about is float. So this property can be very useful when lining block level elements next to each other on a page. So float has 4 values. Left, so floats the element to the left of the parent container, so the element is then treated like an inline element. Float right, floats the element to the right of the parent container, so the element is treated as an inline element again. Inherit, this inherits the float property of the parent element, and then none, the element is not floated. Take a look at these examples and you'll see these in action. Another CSS element we can use is the clear element. So essentially this is the opposite to float. The clear property specifies what elements can float beside the cleared elements and on which side. So the cleared property can have one of the following values. None, allowing floating elements on both sides. This is a default. Left, no floating elements on the left side. right, no floating elements are allowed on the right side. Both, no floating elements allowed on either left or right. Inherit, this element inherits the clear value of its property. So the most common way to use the clear value property is after you've used the float property on an element. So when clearing floats, you should match the clear to the float. If an element is floated to the left, then you should clear to the left. Your element will continue to float, but the cleared element will appear below it on the web page. So here is an example of this in action. Now let's move on to lists. So as we already know, there are two types of lists in HTML. They are unordered lists, where the lists are marked with bullet points by default, and then ordered lists, so the lists are marked with numbers or letters. So in CSS, we can style these lists and the list items. And what we could do with it is we can set different list item markers for the ordered lists, and we can set different list item markers for the unordered lists. We could always set an image as the item marker, and we can add background colours to the lists and the list elements. Let's take a look at these examples below. Have a play around and see what you can come up with. Now let's look at the CSS property align. So you can align a div or any other block level element, in fact, horizontally centered by using margin auto. The div would then have to be a smaller width than the page or the parent container element in order to take effect. So with an image, you'd have to set up it to be a block level element with display block, as you can see here by this example. So you can align elements with position absolute. So you can align these elements to the left, right, top and bottom. So elements that have been absolutely positioned ignore most other elements around them. They only take into account the width, height of the parent element if this element has the following styles applied to it: display block and position relative. So take a look at these examples, try them out for yourself, and then have a look in the browser to see what effects they have. So you can also vertically align elements. So you can vertically align text and images with respect to its container. So to align elements horizontally, it's far simpler. You can set text align center on text and then margin auto on block level elements. So we have a few methods. Method 1, adding padding top, margin top to the element to make it half the height of the container. This only works if the parent element or container has a fixed height. It would also only really work if the element you are aligning in the center has a fixed small height, e.g. a paragraph block. Wouldn't work here when you resize a browser device. So if the element is tall, you could add padding margin to the bottom as well, and that would resolve this. So method 2, using the calc method. So again, this would only work if the element has a container of a fixed height, but it does work on taller elements too. And method 3, so this is the most difficult but the most responsive and the best method in my opinion. So the element and the container element must have a display block and position relative property assigned to it. So you would then write top 50% followed by transform as the name and the value of translate with capital X and then in brackets minus 50%. So this would be on the inner element, the element you're trying to position. So by doing this, it would push the element down 50% of the container, so the top of the element sits at the vertical midpoint, and then to make the middle of the element be vertically centered, the translate x minus 50 value would then move the element up by half the height of it. So if the element has a height of 300 pixels, it would be pushed down by 150 pixels, for example. Take a look at all of these methods in action and then view them in your browser to see the results. Okay, so now we're going to talk about navigation bar. So an easy to use navigation bar is very important for user experience. You want your users to easily navigate to your website between pages. So it needs to be clear, prominent, and most of all, simple. So there's nothing more frustrating for a user when they cannot easily find the page they're looking for. So we're going to talk about the best way to create a navigation bar, and this is to use unordered lists. So each list item, li tag, you would wrap it in an a tag. So this essentially makes each list item a link to the relevant page. And for SEO purposes, search engine optimization purposes, i.e. Google search rankings, you could wrap your unordered list in nav tags. So now we need to style this list using CSS, so it's easy to use and aesthetically pleasing for the user. So firstly, we need to remove the bullet point style from the li tag and the text decoration from the a tag. So we can either set the list items side by side horizontally, so that's if we wanted the navigation bar across the top or bottom, for example, or like in the header or the footer, or if we want the nav bar to be a sidebar, we would leave the list items as block level elements and have them stack on top of each other. So for today's exercise, we're going to make the nav bar where the list items are beside each other, so in the header. And once we start at the list items, we're going to create a hover state on the list items just to indicate to the user the item is clickable. And don't worry, further down the tutorial, we're going to talk about hover states in more detail. So take a look at this example of a navigation bar, a simple navigation bar that will be used on a website. Try it for yourself and have a look at the results. Now let's look at dropdowns. So dropdowns are highly effective in a nav bar where there are subpages of the main or parent pages. So in this example, the dropdown only appears once the user hovers their mouse over the list item. So let's copy this code if you'd like, try it for yourself, change things and see what the results are. Now let's talk about pseudo-classes. So sometimes you want the state of an element to change when the user hovers the mouse over it. So this is most commonly used with clickable buttons, as it indicates to the user that there is an action on that button, e.g. a submit button for a form or a link. So after you declare the element in CSS, you would write a separate declaration, but attach hover to the class or element name at the end. You can also use active, visit and visited as pseudo classes for when it is the current link or if the link has previously been clicked on by the user. So here are some examples of these in action. So when you click your mouse, when you hover your mouse over the link, it will change from black to red. So try it for yourself. So now let's look at pseudo-elements. So a CSS pseudo-element is used to style a specific part of an element. So for example, it can be used to style the first letter or line of an element. You can insert content before or after the content of an element. So the syntax is as follows. So you have the selector and then 2 colons and then the pseudo-element. and then you open up the curly brackets, and then you have the property and the value within that. So now let's look further into this at the first line pseudo-element. So the first line pseudo-element is used to add a special style to the first line of a text area. So this pseudo-element can only be applied if the element is a block level element. So the following example formats the first line in the text in all paragraph elements. So we also have the first letter pseudo-element. So this first letter pseudo-element is used to add a special style to the first letter of a text. The following example formats the first letter of the text in all P elements. So here's an example of this in action. So we can also combine pseudo-elements with classes and IDs. So to do this, you can target specific elements. So for example, P hashtag introduction. So you target an introduction, so a P tag with an ID of introduction, and then two colons, first letter. So this will target the first letter of that paragraph tag with an ID of introduction. So try it out for yourself and see what the results are. Okay, so now we're going to look at the before and after pseudo-elements. The before and after pseudo-element can be used to insert some content before the content of an element or after it, hence the before and after. So the following example would insert an image just before the li element on the list. Now for this one we don't actually need to use a before tag, because we want to insert an image. But for the h2 tag, we're going to insert a before and after tag, and you'll see what the results are. So we need to set the content to be just two single quotation marks, just so it actually appears, and then we set the styling of this element as long as the h2 has a position of relative. If not, this will not work. Okay, so now we're going to move on to some more advanced CSS, and in particular text effects. So we're going to look at the first text effect we're going to look at is text overflow. So the CSS text overflow property specifies how overflowed content that is not displayed should be signaled to the user. So it can be clipped or it can be rendered as an ellipsis, which is the most common method. So an example of this would be here. So p.clip, so there's a paragraph tag with a class of clip. You add a white space of no wrap, you set a width, border, they're all just preferences, and you set an overflow of hidden, and then with your text overflow of clip. So for the ellipses you do exactly the same, apart from the text overflow is ellipses instead. So try these out. So going deeper into the CSS text overflow property, we have CSS word wrapping. So the CSS word wrap property allows words to be able to be broken and wrap around onto the next line. But if a word is too long to fit within an area, it expands outside. So here is an example of this. So P, word wrap, break word. And we also have the CSS word breaking property. So the CSS word break property specifies line breaking rules. So take a look at these examples below and see what it outputs in your browser. Now, another advanced CSS property is object fit. So the CSS object fit property is used to specify how an image or video should be resized to fit its container. So normally if you resize an image or a video for the height and the width, it will either, the ratio won't stay the same, or it will shrink and it become skew and it won't look very good. So this property tells the content to fill the container in a variety of ways, such as preserve the aspect ratio or stretch up and take as much space as possible. So the object fit property can have the following values. Fill, this is default. The replaced content is sized to fill the element's content box. If necessary, the object will be stretched or squished to fit. Contain, the replaced content is scaled to maintain its aspect ratio while fitting within the element's content box. Cover, the replaced content is sized and to maintain its aspect ratio while filling the element's entire content box. The object will be clipped to fit. None, the replaced content is not resized. Scale down, the content is sized as if none or contain were specified. Would result in a smaller concrete object size. So look at the following two examples. The first is without object fit and the second is with object fit. You'll notice the difference here. So now let's move on to CSS animations. So you can animate elements in HTML with CSS. So in this circumstance, there is no need for JavaScript. So what are CSS animations? So animation lets an element gradually change from one style to another. You can change as many CSS properties as you want, as many times as you want. To use CSS animation, you must first specify some keyframes for the animation. So keyframes hold what styles the element will have at certain times. So the keyframe rule. So when you specify CSS styles inside the keyframe rule, the animation will gradually change from the current style to the new style at certain times, at certain specified times. So to get an animation to work, you must bind the animation to an element. The following example binds the example animation to the div element. The animation will last for 4 seconds and it will gradually change the background color of the div element from red to yellow. So the animation duration property defines how long time an animation should take to complete. If the animation duration property is not specified, then no animation will actually occur because the default value is 0 seconds. So here is an example of this happening. So first we set the keyframe to be example, and we set the from property and the to property. And the element this is going to be applied to is below, as you can see. And as you can see here, we've set some various properties like the width, the height and the background color, but also the animation name. So this is important. This is set to example, and this is case sensitive too. So we set the animation name to example, and then in the keyframe, the animation name is example. So it knows which element to be applied to. Try this out for yourself. And the last part of our CSS, advanced CSS, is transitions. So CSS transitions allow you to change the property value smoothly, so from one value to another, over a given duration. So to create a transition effect, you must first specify two things. So you have to specify the CSS property that the effect needs to be added to, and also the duration of this effect. So the syntax of the transition property is as follows. You have transition as the property, and the values are target, followed by transition timing function, followed by duration. So take a look at these examples. So the first one, we have a div with a class of transition. We've set the width and the height. And we've also set a background color on it, just so it's visible. And then we set transition to all, ease in, out, for 2 seconds. The target, we're targeting all elements. The transition timing function, this is ease in, ease out. There are a few predefined ones that you can choose from, but I find this is the most smooth one and it's the nicest looking one. And then 2 seconds is the duration for the transition to take place. And then you would add a hover state in this case. So on the same div with the class of transition, we add a semicolon, we add a colon, and then hover, and then we add some new styling to it. So as you hover over the element, the new styling will be applied, and it will replace what's on the initial statement. So then we have the transition timing function property. So the transition timing function property specifies the speed curve of the transition effect. So this was ease in, ease out in the example. So the transition timing function property can have the following values. So ease, which specifies the transition effect with a slow start, then fast, then end slowly. This is the default. Then of linear, this specifies the transition effect with the same speed from start to end. We have ease in, which specifies a transition with a slow start. Ease out, which is the complete opposite, so it's a slow end, not a slow start. And ease in out has a slow end and start. So cubic Bezier, and then there's 4 values after that. So in this example, it's n, comma, n, comma, n, comma, n. So it lets you define your own values in the cubic Bezier function. So this is something you might have to research, but it's not a commonly used transition timing function. Okay, so the final section of CSS, of the CSS chapter, is nesting selectors. So sometimes we can apply a generic class name to multiple elements. Whilst they might share some of the same styles, maybe that they need individual styles applied to them. So nesting elements allows you to apply specific styles to elements with the same class name in a more efficient way, so have fewer lines of code, especially in the HTML. For example, a H2 tag in a blog post could have the same class name as a H2 tag in the About Us section. So they may share a lot of the same CSS, but they made individual styling applied to them. So a style for the blog section might not be relevant to the About Us section, and vice versa. Okay, so here's the example. So here's the HTML we have. We have a div with blog post container, which wraps a H2 with a class of tagline. Then we have a div with a class called About Us container, which wraps the same H2 class name, but with it's in a different section. So there's different styling needs to be applied to it. Let's take a look below. So here we have some generic styling for the H2 class tagline. And then as you can see below, there's 2 more examples. We have the About Us container H2. So this is so we write the parent declaration first with a space, and then the inner declaration, which in this case is H2. So take a look at yourself, do it in your browser. Take a look at what the result is in your browser. Okay, so now let's look at media queries. So a media query is a CSS technique that was introduced in CSS 3, which is the latest version of CSS. So it uses the @media rule to include a block of CSS properties only if a certain condition is true. So here's a quick example. So say if we say the browser window is 600 pixels or smaller, then this will mean that the background color of the body will be orange. So try this for yourself and see what you get. Okay, now let's look at adding a breakpoint. So we can add a breakpoint where certain parts of the design will behave differently on each side of the breakpoint. So look at this example. So in desktop, we have these styles here. So we have a general col style for a div, which has a border, a height, and it floats left in the display block. And then we have the individual sizes for the other columns. So we have col 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So then we have a breakpoint at 768, which isn't the width of an iPad. So we say that when the device or the browser gets to this width, it will apply these styles instead of those styles. But the styles for the col will still be there. It would just be that the widths have changed, because that's the only thing we've specified for a change to happen. Okay, so thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you've learnt everything you needed to, and I hope you complete the task as well. If there are any questions or queries, please don't hesitate to get in contact with me, and I'll help you as much as I can.